Order in the court. Judge Richard Lancaster banged his gavel, a smug smile curling on his lips. His piercing blue eyes locked onto the old man standing before him. His tone, dripping with arrogance, made the room uneasy. I've seen my fair share of fools try to represent themselves in this courtroom, Lancaster sneered, shifting in his high-backed chair. But this? A washed-up, retired soldier? This is a joke. Murmurs spread across the courtroom. The people in attendance couldn't believe what they were hearing. The old man, dressed in a modest gray suit, stood tall despite the judge's words. His name was James Holloway, a retired Army colonel. His face was lined with age, his hair dusted with silver, but his sharp eyes held a quiet strength. He had refused a public defender, refused any help at all, and that made Lancaster laugh. This is the easiest case of my career. Let's make this quick, the judge said. The spectators chuckled along with him. A group of young lawyers sitting in the back whispered to each other, shaking their heads. But then, something happened. James took a slow step forward, his expression unreadable. And then, in a move that stunned the entire courtroom, he calmly pulled out a neatly folded paper from his suit pocket. He placed it on the defendant's table and smoothed it out with his hand. The room grew quiet. The air shifted. Lancaster's smile faltered. James lifted his chin and spoke for the first time since stepping into the courtroom. His voice was calm, firm, but laced with something else. Confidence. Your Honor, James said, his voice carrying through the room. You're right. I'm no lawyer, but I spent 30 years in the U.S. Army, strategizing under pressure, making decisions that held lives in the balance. I know how to read the battlefield. He tapped the paper in front of him. And this is my battlefield today. Judge Lancaster narrowed his eyes. What is that? James didn't answer. Instead, he looked toward the door. At that moment, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open. The entire room turned to see who had entered. A tall figure strode in. A man in a sharp, perfectly pressed navy blue suit, his presence commanding, as if he had been summoned for this very moment. James' lips curled into a knowing smile. The entire courtroom was stunned into silence. Because this man was no ordinary attorney. He was one of the most brilliant legal minds in the country. And he was James Holloway's attorney. A week earlier, James Holloway never imagined he'd be standing in a courtroom, much less being mocked by a judge. His life had been simple, peaceful even. Retirement had given him the time to enjoy the little things, his morning coffee, his long walks through the park, and his visits to the local Veterans Center, where he mentored young soldiers adjusting to civilian life. But then, everything changed. It all started with a knock on his door. James had just set down his coffee when he heard it. 3 sharp knocks. Urgent. Unfamiliar. He opened the door to find a police officer standing there, a stern expression on his face. Colonel Holloway, the officer asked. That's me, James answered, his grip tightening on the doorframe. I'm afraid you're under arrest. The words hit him like a freight train. What? Before James could fully process what was happening, the officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs. You're being charged with fraud and obstruction of justice. James' heart pounded. Fraud. He had never stolen a cent in his life. Sir, please turn around, the officer instructed. His instincts screamed at him to resist, to demand answers. But his military training kept him still. He turned around, allowing the cold metal to snap around his wrists. As they led him away, his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, gasped from her porch. James, what's happening? James didn't know what to say, because he had no idea what was happening himself. The ride to the police station was long and silent. His mind raced, trying to figure out how he could be accused of something he hadn't done. Fraud? Obstruction of justice? It made no sense. The officer who had arrested him didn't speak much, but James noticed his hands were steady, his actions careful, not aggressive. When they arrived at the station, James was processed like any other suspect. Mugshots, fingerprints, a cold metal bench. Then, after what felt like hours, an officer led him to an interrogation room. The walls were gray. A single overhead light buzzed softly, and across the table sat a man in a sleek black suit, a smirk playing on his lips. Mr. Holloway, the man said smoothly. I'm District Attorney Kenneth Reeves. You might want to get comfortable. You're in a lot of trouble. James sat down slowly, his eyes never leaving the man's. I'd like to know why I'm here. The DA chuckled, tossing a file onto the table. It slid across the surface until it stopped in front of James. "Go ahead," Reeves said. "Take a look." James opened the file. What he saw inside made his stomach drop. Bank statements, transactions, legal documents. All of them tied to his name. All of them fake. And then, the final page, a photograph. A blurry security camera image of a man walking into a bank. A man who vaguely resembled him. James clenched his jaw. "This isn't me." Reeves leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "A judge will decide that." James felt anger bubbling inside him. He had spent his life serving his country, and now he was being framed? He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. He needed to think. And then, like a flicker of light in the darkness, a thought crossed his mind. A name. There was one person he knew could help him. He just needed to find a way to reach him. But first, he had to get out of here. And the only way to do that was to step into the battlefield. Back in the courtroom, Judge Lancaster was growing impatient. "Well," he said, tapping his gavel against the desk. "Who is this mystery attorney of yours?" James remained silent, his eyes on the man walking towards him. The entire courtroom held its breath. Judge Lancaster's smirk twitched. "I asked you a question, Holloway." James finally spoke. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady. "Allow me to introduce you to my attorney." The tall man stepped forward, his sharp eyes locking onto the judge's. And in that moment, Judge Lancaster's arrogance wavered. Because he recognized this man, and he knew exactly what kind of trouble he was in. Silence filled the courtroom like a thick fog. Every pair of eyes locked onto the tall man standing beside James Holloway. Judge Lancaster's arrogant smirk faded as recognition dawned in his eyes. His fingers twitched around the gavel. The man in the navy blue suit adjusted his cuffs, his movements slow, deliberate. Then he finally spoke. "Good afternoon, Your Honor." His voice was deep, commanding. "I'm Alexander Graves, representing Colonel James Holloway." A stunned murmur swept through the courtroom. Alexander Graves. The name alone carried weight. He wasn't just any attorney. He was one of the best defense lawyers in the country. A man who had single-handedly dismantled corrupt corporations, exposed high-level government scandals, and won cases no one thought were winnable. And now, he was standing beside a retired soldier accused of fraud. Judge Lancaster cleared his throat, trying to mask his surprise. "Mr. Graves," he said, his voice tight. "I wasn't aware Colonel Holloway had legal representation." James finally spoke, his tone unwavering. "You didn't ask." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom, but Lancaster's glare silenced them. Graves stepped forward, placing a single hand on the defendant's table. "Your Honor, before we proceed any further, I have a motion to dismiss all charges against my client." The tension in the room spiked. Lancaster scoffed. "On what grounds?" Graves pulled out a thick manila folder from his briefcase and slid it onto the judge's bench. "On the grounds that this entire case is built on falsified evidence and a complete misrepresentation of facts." The judge hesitated before flipping the folder open. His eyes flickered across the documents, his smug expression slowly twisting into something else, something resembling concern. But before he could say anything, the doors to the courtroom burst open again. A uniformed officer rushed in, holding a slip of paper. He looked directly at Lancaster, then at Graves, before making his way to the judge's bench. "Your Honor," the officer said, his voice urgent, "I think you need to see this." Lancaster snatched the paper and scanned it. His face drained of color. Something had just shifted. Something big. A few days earlier, James Holloway sat alone in his holding cell. The metal bench beneath him was cold, the air thick with the smell of damp concrete. He had barely slept. His mind ran through 1,000 different scenarios, but none of them made sense. Why him? Why now? The charges were absurd. Fraud. Obstruction of justice? He had spent his entire life living by a strict moral code. There was no way he had done any of this. Then, as if the universe was answering his question, a voice called from outside his cell. "You don't belong here." James lifted his head. Standing just beyond the bars was a man in a dark suit. His graying hair was slicked back, his sharp eyes calculating. District Attorney Kenneth Reeves. James stood slowly. "If you know that, then why am I here?" Reeves smirked. "Because some people think you're a threat." James narrowed his eyes. "A threat? To who?" Reeves stepped closer, lowering his voice. "That's not important. What's important is that you play along." Plead guilty, take a reduced sentence, and this all goes away. James felt his fists clench. I didn't do anything. Reeves chuckled, shaking his head. That doesn't matter, Colonel. What matters is what people can prove. And right now, all the evidence points to you. James stared at him, his mind racing. This wasn't about justice. This was a setup. Reeves turned to leave, but paused. Think about it, Holloway. You're an old man. Do you really want to spend your final years in prison? Or would you rather take the deal and walk out of here in a few months? James remained silent. Reeves smirked. I'll give you some time to think about it. The moment Reeves walked away, James knew one thing for sure. He needed help. Not just any help. The best help he could get. And there was only one man he could trust with that. James sat on the hard cot in his cell, staring at the ceiling. He hadn't spoken to Alexander Graves in years. Not since the war. But if there was one man who could navigate the battlefield of a courtroom, it was him. He took a deep breath, then called for the guard. I need to make a phone call. Alexander Graves picked up on the first ring. James. James exhaled. I need you. There was a pause. Where are you? Graves asked. Jail. Another pause. Then, Graves' voice hardened. Give me 24 hours. James closed his eyes. Help was on the way. Back in the courtroom, Judge Lancaster swallowed hard as he finished reading the paper the officer had handed him. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of his desk. Whatever he had just seen, it had completely rattled him. Graves crossed his arms, waiting. Finally, Lancaster set the paper down. He adjusted his robe, his voice forced and controlled. I need a brief recess. Bang. The gavel struck. Lancaster rose quickly from his chair and disappeared into his chambers, slamming the door behind him. The moment he was gone, the courtroom erupted into hushed whispers. James turned to Graves. What just happened? Graves allowed himself a small smirk. We just rattled the hornet's nest. James raised an eyebrow. How bad? Graves exhaled. Bad enough that the judge just realized he's been caught in the middle of something much bigger than he expected. James studied his old friend. You knew this was going to happen, didn't you? Graves didn't answer. Because deep down, they both knew something. This wasn't just a trial. It was a war. And they had just fired the first shot. The courtroom buzzed with anxious whispers as Judge Lancaster hurried into his chambers, slamming the door behind him. The way his face had drained of color was enough to send a ripple of unease through the spectators. James Holloway sat still, his hands resting on the table, but his eyes flickered toward Alexander Graves. What was on that paper? James asked in a low voice. Graves tapped his fingers on the table, his expression unreadable. Something he wasn't expecting. James sighed, rubbing his temple. You want to be a little less cryptic? Graves turned slightly, his sharp gaze locking onto James. That officer wasn't just bringing the judge a routine document. That was an emergency motion, one we filed just before stepping into court. And it contained something very inconvenient for certain people. James narrowed his eyes. Inconvenient how? Graves leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only James could hear. Let's just say, the evidence against you? It wasn't just fake, it was planted. And the paper Lancaster just read? It proves it. James inhaled sharply, his fingers tightening into a fist. You mean, someone set you up? Graves confirmed. And now, the judge knows it. The air felt heavier. James had spent decades in the military, navigating war zones, facing enemies both seen and unseen. But this was different. Because this battle wasn't fought with weapons. It was fought with lies. And someone wanted him buried under them. 2 days earlier, James sat across from Graves in a dimly lit room at the detention center. A thick pane of glass separated them, a telephone pressed against each of their ears. I don't have much time, Alex, James said. They're setting me up for something I didn't do. Graves studied him, his expression unreadable. Tell me everything from the beginning. James exhaled, closing his eyes for a moment before speaking. I was arrested out of nowhere. They claimed I was involved in some financial fraud scheme. But it doesn't make sense. They showed me documents, bank transactions, signatures that weren't mine, a blurry security camera image that looks vaguely like me, but it's not me. Graves listened carefully, nodding. And who's leading this case against you? James hesitated before saying the name. Kenneth Reeves. Graves went completely still. Then, his jaw tightened. That explains a lot. James frowned. You know him? Graves leaned forward slightly, his eyes dark with something unreadable. Let's just say, Reeves and I have history. James raised an eyebrow. What kind of history? Graves didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tapped his fingers on the table before finally speaking. Reeves isn't just a district attorney, James. He's ambitious, ruthless, and has a habit of targeting people who stand in the way of certain interests. James felt a chill run down his spine. Whose interests? Graves exhaled, his voice even but laced with steel. People who don't like soldiers asking too many questions. James sat back, his mind spinning. He wasn't just being framed. He was being silenced. Back in the courtroom, the heavy wooden doors swung open again. Judge Lancaster stepped out, his face paler than before, but his jaw set in frustration. He strode back to his bench and sat down. Proceedings will resume, he announced, his voice carefully controlled. Graves stood, buttoning his suit jacket. Your Honor, before we continue, I'd like to officially enter our emergency motion into the record. Lancaster clenched his jaw. Motion noted. Murmurs spread through the crowd. They could all see it. Something had shifted. Graves wasn't just defending James. He was exposing something bigger. Lancaster turned to Reeves, who had remained quiet until now, his expression unreadable. Mr. Reeves, the judge said carefully, I'd like an explanation for this discrepancy in the evidence. Reeves stood, smoothing out his tie. Your Honor, he said, his voice perfectly measured. I was not aware of any fabrication in the evidence. If there was an error, it certainly wasn't intentional. James felt a surge of anger. An error? That was what they were calling this. Graves, however, remained calm. He walked slowly toward the prosecution's table, his eyes locked onto Reeves. You weren't aware? Graves asked, his voice smooth but sharp. That's interesting, because my team found the altered documents sitting in your office's digital archives. A gasp rippled through the room. Reeves' jaw twitched. Graves continued, pulling out another file. Your Honor, I have here a forensic report proving that the evidence used to arrest my client was altered, digitally manipulated to frame Colonel Holloway. And guess what else we found? Lancaster remained silent, gripping the arms of his chair. Graves' voice dropped, almost a whisper, but it carried through the courtroom like a thunderclap. A direct link between this falsified evidence and an offshore account tied to an unnamed donor. The room erupted into chaos. Lancaster slammed his gavel down. Order, but nothing could settle the shock that had just detonated through the courtroom. Because what Graves had just revealed, it meant this wasn't just a mistake. This was a conspiracy, and it went far beyond James Holloway. James sat perfectly still, watching the chaos unfold around him. The pieces were finally coming together. Someone had gone through a lot of trouble to frame him. And now, thanks to Graves, they had just been caught in the act. But there was one question left. Who was pulling the strings? And just how deep did this go? The courtroom was a storm of murmurs, shock, and barely contained chaos. The revelation that the evidence against James Holloway had been falsified and linked to an offshore account was a bombshell. Judge Lancaster, usually so smug and in control, looked visibly shaken. He slammed his gavel once more, harder this time. I said order in the court. The room gradually quieted, but the tension remained thick, pressing against everyone like an unseen force. Reeves, his usual cocky demeanor gone, adjusted his tie. His mind was racing. He had been so sure, so confident, that this case would be easy. Yet now, Alexander Graves had flipped the script. Mr. Reeves, Lancaster said, his voice sharp, I assume you have an explanation for this. Reeves opened his mouth, then shut it. His usual smooth words failed him. For the first time in his career, he was caught. Your Honor, I will need time to review these claims, Reeves finally said, his voice carefully controlled. This is the first I'm hearing of any falsified evidence, and I assure you, my office does not engage in misconduct. Graves let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. Of course, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Because we all believe that. James, watching the back and forth, clenched his jaw. Something was off. Reeves was nervous, but not in the way a guilty man should be. It wasn't fear of being caught. It was something else. It was fear of something bigger. 3 nights earlier, the lights of the detention center buzzed dimly overhead as James lay awake on his cot. The other prisoners had long since fallen asleep, but his mind wouldn't rest. He replayed everything in his head. The arrest, the so-called evidence. Reeves' smug face during the interrogation. Nothing made sense. Then, just as his eyes began to close, he heard it. A soft creak. James stayed completely still, his instincts kicking in. The sound was coming from the hallway just outside his cell. Someone was there. Slowly, he turned his head just enough to catch a glimpse through the bars. A shadow. Tall. Unmoving. Watching. James kept his breathing steady, his military training keeping him from reacting. Then, the shadow shifted. And just before disappearing down the hallway, a voice, low, barely a whisper, reached his ears. You should have stayed quiet. A chill ran down James' spine. This wasn't just a wrongful arrest. Someone wanted him silenced. Back in the courtroom, Graves closed the file he had presented and turned back to Lancaster. Your Honor, I formally request that all charges against my client be dropped immediately. This case has been tainted by fraudulent evidence, and to continue would be a miscarriage of justice. Lancaster's fingers drummed against his bench. He was cornered. He knew it. Everyone in the courtroom knew it. But before he could respond, Reeves spoke up. Your Honor, I'd like to request a private sidebar with the prosecution and defense before any decisions are made. Graves raised an eyebrow, afraid of open court. Reeves shot him a glare. I think it would be beneficial for everyone involved to discuss this matter privately. Lancaster hesitated before finally sighing. Fine. We'll take a short recess. Mr. Reeves, Mr. Graves, in my chambers. Now. The courtroom burst into whispers again as the judge stood and walked toward his private office. James watched as Graves leaned in toward him before following. Stay sharp, Graves murmured. Something's not right. James nodded. Something wasn't just not right. Something was very wrong. Inside Judge Lancaster's chambers, Lancaster sat behind his large mahogany desk, rubbing his temples. Across from him, Reeves and Graves stood, neither of them sitting. All right, Lancaster said, his voice low. What's going on here? Graves folded his arms. That's what I'd like to know. Why is my client being framed? Reeves exhaled slowly, glancing at Lancaster before turning to Graves. Look, he said, his voice quieter than before. This isn't about me. This case was handed to me from higher up. Graves narrowed his eyes. Higher up. Reeves hesitated. Lancaster suddenly looked more uncomfortable than before, shifting in his seat. Graves caught it instantly. The judge knew something. Your Honor, Graves said, stepping closer. Who's pulling the strings? Lancaster clenched his jaw. I don't know what you're talking about. Cut the act, Graves shot back. Someone is behind this, and it sure as hell isn't just Reeves. Reeves stiffened. I suggest you tread carefully, Graves. Or what? Graves challenged. You going to frame me too? Reeves didn't answer, and that silence was more telling than anything. Graves shook his head. Unbelievable. You both know exactly what's happening here, but neither of you will say it. Lancaster finally spoke. His voice was quieter, but there was an unmistakable weight behind it. Graves, you don't understand. This goes beyond one case. Graves leaned forward, his voice low and sharp. Then enlighten me. Lancaster hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said something that made Graves go still. Something that changed everything. James Holloway was never supposed to make it to trial. Back in the courtroom, James sat alone, his mind spinning. He could feel it now. Something bigger than him was at play. And if he didn't figure out who was behind it soon, he wouldn't just be fighting for his freedom. He'd be fighting for his life. Judge Lancaster's words hung in the air like a dark cloud. James Holloway was never supposed to make it to trial. Graves narrowed his eyes, his body going completely still. What does that mean? He asked, his voice low, dangerous. Lancaster looked away, fingers tightening on the desk as if he regretted saying anything at all. Reeves, standing stiffly beside him, exhaled sharply. This conversation is over, he muttered. He turned to leave, but Graves stepped in front of him, blocking his path. Not so fast, Graves said coldly. You're not walking away from this, Reeves. Not this time. Reeves clenched his jaw, refusing to meet his gaze. I have nothing more to say. Graves let out a humorless chuckle. That's funny, because I think if we dig a little deeper, we'll find plenty. Lancaster finally looked up. Graves, listen to me, he said, his voice tense. This isn't just about Holloway. It's bigger than him, bigger than you. There are people, powerful people, who don't want this case unraveled. Graves didn't flinch. Then they shouldn't have framed an innocent man. Lancaster rubbed his face. exhaling slowly. You don't understand. They don't play fair. If you keep pushing. What? Graves interrupted. They'll come after me too? The judge didn't answer. That was all the confirmation Graves needed. Reeves cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. This meeting is over. Not yet, Graves said smoothly. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out another file, flipping it open. Because before I let you both crawl back to whatever hole you came from, I want to show you something. He turned the file around and slid it across Lancaster's desk. Lancaster hesitated before looking down, and then his face went pale. Reeves frowned, stepping forward to see what had rattled the judge. The moment his eyes landed on the documents, his lips parted slightly, a hint of panic flashing across his face. This isn't possible, Reeves muttered. Graves smirked. Oh, but it is. The file contained everything. Financial records, hidden transactions, names, and most damning of all, a signed document linking a mysterious, high-level organization to the fabricated evidence against James Holloway. This isn't just some rogue prosecutor trying to take down an old soldier, Graves said calmly. This is part of something much bigger. Lancaster swallowed hard, looking up at him. Where did you get this? Graves shrugged. Let's just say I have friends in very good places. In truth, Graves had spent the last 24 hours working with a private investigator, digging into every single piece of evidence against Holloway. And what he had found, it led straight to a secret network of powerful elites. People who controlled more than just courtrooms. People who controlled outcomes. Reeves looked like he wanted to be anywhere but here. His hands clenched at his sides, his normally smooth composure cracking. You have no idea what you've done, he whispered. Graves raised an eyebrow. Oh, I think I do. Then, without another word, Graves turned on his heel and walked toward the door. He had everything he needed. And now, it was time to go to war. Back in the courtroom, James sat in silence, waiting. Something had changed. He could feel it. The energy in the courtroom was different, heavier. The spectators had quieted, and the officers stationed near the doors were exchanging glances, their hands resting a little too close to their weapons. Something wasn't right. Then, before James could fully process the uneasy feeling settling in his gut, the doors to the judge's chambers burst open. Graves strode out, his expression unreadable, his steps quick and purposeful. James sat up straighter. But then, something happened that made his blood run cold. The courtroom doors at the back suddenly swung open. Two men in dark suits stepped inside, their gazes scanning the room. They weren't police. They weren't reporters. They weren't supposed to be here. James' military instincts kicked in immediately. The way they moved, the way their eyes scanned for threats. He had seen it before. They were operatives, and they weren't here for the trial. James stiffened. They were here for him. Graves had just reached the defense table when he noticed the men. His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't stop moving. Instead, he leaned down and murmured two words to James. Stay ready. James didn't need to be told twice. Whatever was about to happen, it was happening now. Judge Lancaster returned to the bench moments later, his face composed, but his movements slightly rushed. He cleared his throat. We are back in session. But before he could continue, one of the suited men at the back of the courtroom took a step forward. Your Honor, he said, his voice smooth but firm. We need to speak with you. Immediately, Lancaster looked up, his expression guarded. And you are? The man pulled out a badge. Federal Intelligence Bureau. A hushed gasp swept through the courtroom. James clenched his fists under the table. The FIB. This had just escalated to an entirely new level. Graves remained perfectly still, watching, calculating. Lancaster exhaled, looking between the agents and Graves. Then he nodded. 10-minute recess. Bang. The gavel fell. But before anyone could move, the agents turned to James. Colonel Holloway, one of them said, their tone formal. You need to come with us. James didn't move. His mind raced. This wasn't right. They weren't here to help. They were here to remove him. The pieces clicked into place all at once. They had failed to keep him locked away, failed to frame him quietly. So now, they were going for the last option. James slowly stood, his eyes never leaving the agents. I'm not going anywhere, he said evenly. The first agent's expression didn't change. That wasn't a request. Graves stepped forward smoothly, placing a hand on James' shoulder. Gentlemen, Graves said casually, but there was steel in his voice. If you want to take my client, you'd better have an arrest warrant. The agents hesitated. They didn't have one. Graves smiled. Thought so. James could see the tension in their faces. They weren't used to being challenged. And that meant something. They were desperate. Before anyone could react, one of the agents reached inside his suit. James saw it happening in slow motion. A weapon. He moved. In a split second, James lunged, grabbing the agent's wrist and twisting it sharply. The man grunted in pain as his firearm clattered to the floor. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Shouting. Movement. The sound of officers drawing weapons. The second agent reached for his own gun. But before he could pull it, Graves had already stepped in, kicking the chair beside him straight into the man's legs. The agent stumbled, and within moments, the court officers were on them, restraining both men. James breathed heavily, stepping back. The entire courtroom stared in shock. Judge Lancaster, looking as pale as a ghost, gripped the edge of his bench. Graves adjusted his suit, then turned to Lancaster with a smirk. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "I believe my client is in danger, and I suggest you do something about it." Lancaster swallowed hard. Then, in a voice that barely masked his fear, he turned to the officers. "Take them into custody." The agent's struggle stopped, because in that moment, they knew. They had failed, and James Holloway was still standing. The courtroom was in chaos. Officers restrained the two rogue FIB agents, their faces twisted in frustration as they realized their mission had collapsed before their eyes. The crowd, still stunned from what had just happened, buzzed with hushed whispers and wide-eyed stares. James Holloway stood motionless, his breathing steady despite the adrenaline still surging through his veins. He had seen combat before, had fought in wars, but there was something different about this. This wasn't a battlefield. This was a courtroom. And yet, the same forces of power, corruption, and deception were at play. Judge Lancaster's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his robe, clearing his throat. "Take those men into custody," he ordered again, his voice more forceful this time. The court officers hauled the agents to their feet, slapping handcuffs onto their wrists. One of them, the one James had disarmed, turned his head sharply and locked eyes with him. "This isn't over," the agent muttered under his breath. James met his gaze evenly. "No, it's not." The man's nostrils flared, but before he could say another word, he was dragged out of the courtroom. Judge Lancaster turned to Graves, his expression unreadable. "You still want to continue this trial?" Graves asked smoothly, straightening his tie. Lancaster exhaled heavily. "Mr. Graves, I—" But before he could finish, a sudden, sharp beeping sound interrupted him. Everyone turned toward the back of the courtroom. One of the officers had just pulled a small radio from his belt. His face went pale as he listened to the voice crackling through it. Then, without a word, he sprinted toward the exit. Graves frowned. What now? James got twisted. Something was happening. Something bad. Outside the courthouse. The moment the courtroom doors burst open, James, Graves, and the remaining officers stepped out into the hallway, only to freeze at what they saw. A swarm of black SUVs had pulled up in front of the courthouse, their tinted windows shielding whoever was inside. More men in dark suits, armed and waiting, had begun surrounding the building. This wasn't just another arrest attempt. This was a full-blown operation. Graves let out a low whistle. Looks like someone's getting nervous. James clenched his jaw. Yeah, and they're done pretending. The lead officer, now visibly shaken, turned to Lancaster. Your Honor, we have a situation. No kidding, Graves muttered. Judge Lancaster, looking as if he had finally lost whatever control he thought he had, pinched the bridge of his nose. Who are they? James already knew. They're here to make sure this trial never finishes, he said grimly. Graves exhaled. Then we need to get out of here. Now. But before they could move, the doors at the courthouse entrance slammed open, and a man stepped inside. Not just any man. A man James recognized instantly. Tall, refined, wearing a flawless, jet-black suit. His graying hair was slicked back, and his cold, calculating eyes scanned the room like a predator assessing its prey. Kenneth Reeves stiffened at the sight of him. Oh no, he whispered. Graves glanced at Reeves, then back at the man. I take it you know him. James' hands curled into fists. Unfortunately, the man's name was Donovan King, and he was one of the most dangerous men in the country. 10 years earlier, the desert sun burned down on the convoy as it rolled through the dust-covered valley. Colonel James Holloway sat in the lead vehicle, gripping his rifle. The mission had been classified, high priority. Intel had suggested a secretive group was moving weapons through an abandoned military base. But James knew better. This wasn't just about weapons. It was about who was moving them. And one name had stood out among the intel reports. Donovan Kane, a man with no official records, no confirmed history, no allegiance to any country. Yet, somehow, he always appeared wherever power shifted hands. And now, James was about to confront him. But what should have been a standard operation quickly turned into a nightmare. Before the convoy even reached its target, they were ambushed. Explosions rocked the ground, sending vehicles flying. Gunfire erupted from the cliffs above. James barely had time to react before his vehicle was hit, flipping onto its side. The last thing he remembered before everything went black was Kane's voice. Soft, cold, almost amused. "You should have stayed out of this, Colonel." Back in the courthouse, James' eyes locked onto Kane's. The past came rushing back like a bullet. Kane smirked, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. "Colonel Holloway," he said smoothly. "It's been a long time." James forced himself to stay calm. Not long enough. Graves, sensing the tension, stepped between them. "All right, I don't know who you are, but I don't like you already. So why don't you tell us what you want?" Kane's smirk didn't falter. "I'm here to offer a resolution." James narrowed his eyes. "A resolution?" Kane nodded. "Drop this case. Walk away, and you'll never have to worry about any of this again." Graves let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, that's rich. Let me guess. If we don't, bad things happen." Kane tilted his head slightly. "You're an intelligent man, Mr. Graves. I don't think I need to spell it out for you." James took a step forward. "And if I say no?" Kane's smirk faded slightly. "Then I make sure you disappear." The threat was clear, and it wasn't just aimed at James. It was aimed at everyone in this courthouse. Judge Lancaster, the officers, the jury, the reporters, all of them were loose ends. James glanced at Graves. Graves nodded. He understood. There was only one way out of this, and it wasn't by playing Kane's game. James exhaled, then looked Kane dead in the eye. "Go to hell." For the first time, Kane's expression darkened. "You just made a very dangerous choice, Colonel," he murmured. James didn't flinch. "I've made worse." Kane exhaled sharply through his nose, then turned to his men. "Shut it down." In an instant, the suited men outside the courthouse began moving, blocking exits, cutting off escape routes. Graves muttered under his breath. "Well, that escalated fast." James cracked his knuckles. "Yeah, but I've been in worse." Kane turned back to them, his smirk returning. "Let's see if you survive this one." And just like that, the battle had begun. The courthouse was now a war zone. Kane's men moved with military precision, sealing the exits, positioning themselves in a way that made it clear no one was getting out unless Kane allowed it. The police officers stationed inside hesitated, their hands hovering near their weapons, unsure of what to do. These weren't regular criminals. These were professionals, the kind who didn't hesitate before pulling a trigger. James Holloway scanned the room, taking stock of every movement. He had been in countless ambushes before, and this had all the signs of a well-coordinated one. Kane wasn't here to negotiate anymore. He was here to end this. Graves, standing beside him, exhaled slowly. "I take it diplomacy is off the table?" James smirked slightly. "Looks that way." Judge Lancaster, his face pale, stood up from the bench. "This is a court of law," he said, his voice trembling but trying to hold authority. "I demand you stand down immediately." Kane turned his cold gaze toward the judge. "I respect the law, Your Honor, but unfortunately for you, the people I work for don't. And neither do the men outside who are ready to clean up this mess if you don't cooperate." The meaning was clear. If Lancaster, James, and Graves didn't back down, everyone in this courthouse was at risk. James clenched his jaw. He knew what was coming next. Kane was going to eliminate all witnesses, and that meant they had only minutes to act. Graves leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need a way out. Fast." James' mind worked quickly, scanning for weak points. He spotted a side exit near the jury stand, currently unguarded. But they wouldn't get far without a distraction. Then, he noticed something else, something Kane and his men hadn't accounted for. The civilians in the courtroom, the reporters, the jury, the spectators. They were all watching this unfold, terrified but recording everything. James' lips curled into a grim smile. Kane had underestimated the power of public exposure. Outside the courthouse, News vans were lined up across the street, cameras rolling. They had been covering what should have been a standard trial. Now, they were watching an armed lockdown unfold. A reporter, holding a microphone with shaking hands, turned to the camera. "We are live outside the Holloway trial, where something unprecedented is happening. Armed men, who are not law enforcement, have taken control of the courthouse. We don't know who they are or what they want, but..." She turned her head as more black SUVs pulled up. More of Kane's men. Her voice shook. "This is looking less like a trial and more like a siege." Back in the courtroom, James took a deep breath. They needed a catalyst. Something to throw Kane's plans off balance. Then it hit him. He turned to Lancaster. "Judge, how fast can you call a mistrial?" Lancaster blinked. "What?" "If you call a mistrial, everything resets," James said. "The case collapses, Kane loses his leverage, and..." Kane suddenly spoke, cutting through the conversation. "Are we done whispering?" His tone was amused, but his patience was running thin. James exhaled. "Not yet." Then, without another word, he stepped toward the nearest camera. The courtroom had a live-feed camera broadcasting to local stations. James turned directly to it, locking eyes with every viewer watching from their homes. "This is Colonel James Holloway," he said firmly. "If you're watching this, understand something. This is not a trial. This is a cover-up. And these men, they are here to kill everyone in this room to protect their secrets." Kane's face darkened. "Enough." James ignored him. "I fought for this country. I bled for it. And I'll be damned if I let people like him," he pointed at Kane, "destroy everything that justice stands for." Kane took a step forward, his men raising their weapons. James didn't stop. "If anything happens to me, to this judge, or to anyone in this courthouse, the American people will know who's responsible." The message was clear. James had just turned this into a national spectacle. There was no more quiet execution. If Kane killed them now, he wouldn't just be removing a problem. He'd be exposing himself. The weight of the moment settled over the room. Kane's smirk twitched. He exhaled through his nose, his patience snapping. "You always were a problem, Colonel," he muttered. "Fine. If you want to play this game, let's play." He turned to his men. "Lock down the building. No one leaves." James tensed. Kane wasn't backing off. He was doubling down. And that meant the only way out now was to fight their way out. 10 minutes later, the jury had been moved to the back of the courtroom, guarded by frightened officers. Lancaster sat rigid at his bench, knowing he was now a hostage in his own court. Kane leaned against the judge's podium, checking his watch. "It's only a matter of time," he said, his voice casual. "Eventually, the media will lose interest. The police will be ordered to stand down. And then..." He flashed a cold smile. "We finish what we started." James sat quietly, his mind racing. They were running out of options. He glanced at Graves, who nodded subtly. They both knew what had to be done. Then, a loud explosion rattled the courthouse. Kane's eyes snapped up. "What the..." The fire alarm blared. Smoke seeped in through the hallway. Panic spread like wildfire. Kane's men shouted, turning toward the entrance. That was all James needed. He moved. Fast. Launching himself forward, he tackled the nearest guard, grabbing his gun before the man even had time to react. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Graves swung a chair into another attacker, sending him crashing into a row of benches. Police officers, finally realizing they weren't just witnesses but law enforcement, drew their weapons and fired warning shots. Kane stumbled backward, his calm demeanor shattering. James turned the gun on him. "Not so fun when the fight's even, huh?" he said. Kane's jaw clenched, but he didn't look afraid. He looked amused. "Colonel," Kane said softly, "do you really think this is the end?" James didn't lower his weapon. "I think it's the end for you." Kane slowly raised his hands, but something about his smile sent a cold feeling down James' spine. "You still don't get it," Kane murmured. "You may win this fight, Holloway, but you've already lost the war." Before James could process what he meant, one of Kane's men activated something on his wrist. A signal. A detonation signal. James' stomach dropped. Then, boom. The entire courthouse shook. Smoke and dust filled the air. Windows shattered. People screamed. Kane's men had triggered something. And just like that, the courthouse wasn't just under siege. It was collapsing. The explosion ripped through the courthouse, shaking the walls with a deafening boom. Glass shattered. Smoke billowed. Dust filled the air, making it impossible to see. James Holloway hit the ground hard, covering his head as debris rained down. He could hear screaming. Officers, civilians, even Kane's own men caught in the blast. Graves' voice cut through the chaos. James. James coughed, forcing himself up onto one knee. His vision was blurry, but his instincts kicked in. He had been through worse. And he wasn't about to die here. He blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of the situation. The explosion hadn't destroyed the entire courthouse, but it had done enough damage to plunge everything into confusion. A distraction. Kane had planned this. James' eyes darted around through the dust. And then, he saw him, Donovan Kane, slipping through the side exit, two of his men flanking him. James' adrenaline spiked. Not today. He pushed himself up and bolted after him, ignoring the burning in his lungs. Outside the courthouse, the streets were chaos. Sirens wailed, news cameras swung wildly to capture the scene, and officers scrambled, trying to figure out what had just happened. Kane moved fast, slipping into one of the black SUVs waiting outside. James burst through the doors just in time to see the vehicle speeding away. For half a second, it felt like he had lost him. Then, tires screeched. Graves appeared beside him, panting. "I really hope you have a plan." James didn't answer. His eyes locked onto a nearby police motorcycle. Graves followed his gaze and sighed. Of course. Before anyone could stop him, James ran toward the bike, swung his leg over, and gunned the engine. Graves groaned. "You're insane." James grinned. "You coming or not?" Graves hesitated for exactly 1 second before climbing on behind him. "You'd better not get me killed, Colonel." James twisted the throttle, and the bike roared to life. They shot forward, weaving through panicked civilians and speeding after Kane's SUV. The chase was on. The highway. Kane's driver pushed the SUV to its limits, dodging through traffic as they tried to shake James. Inside the vehicle, Kane sat perfectly still, watching through the rear window. One of his men turned to him. "Sir, do we engage?" Kane smirked. "Let him come." The SUV suddenly swerved, taking a hard turn onto an industrial road leading toward the docks. James didn't hesitate, leaning hard into the turn, the tires of the bike screeching against the asphalt. Graves clutched onto him. "I swear, if we survive this, I'm charging extra for my services." James smirked. "Noted." Up ahead, Kane's SUV sped toward a secluded part of the docks. A trap. James knew it. And he didn't care. He had spent too much time being hunted. It was time to turn the tables. The final standoff. The bike skidded to a stop at the docks, dust kicking up around them. Kane's SUV had come to a halt near a warehouse, his men already stepping out, weapons raised. James and Graves didn't move at first. Then, slowly, James swung his leg off the bike. He met Kane's gaze across the distance. Kane chuckled. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" James cracked his knuckles. "Not really." Kane exhaled, shaking his head. "You don't get it, Holloway. You think this is about you? About some trial?" He spread his arms, gesturing around them. "You are nothing in the grand scheme of things. There are people above me, above you, above this entire system. You can't win this." James took another step forward. "Then why are you running?" Kane's smirk twitched. For the first time, James saw something behind those cold eyes. Doubt. Fear. Because for all Kane's power, for all his connections, James was still standing. And he wasn't backing down. Kane sighed dramatically. "Fine. If you want to die that badly." He nodded to his men. "Kill them." Gunfire erupted. James dove behind a stack of shipping crates as bullets ripped through the air. Graves hit the ground beside him. "Fantastic plan, James. I especially like the part where we get shot at." James ignored him, reloading the gun he had taken from the courthouse guard earlier. "Stay low." Graves peeked over the crates, flinching as a bullet whizzed past. "Remind me why I agreed to this." James smirked. "Because you hate losing." Graves sighed. "Touché." Then, together, they moved. James rolled out from cover, firing off precise shots. One of Kane's men went down instantly. Graves, despite being a lawyer, wasn't useless either. He grabbed a fallen gun and laid down suppressing fire, forcing Kane's men to scramble. The tide was shifting, and Kane knew it. His men were dropping one by one. The well-executed ambush was turning into a disaster. James saw Kane take a step back, his hand going for something inside his jacket. A small detonator. James' eyes widened. "Oh, no you don't." He sprinted forward. Kane pressed the trigger. Nothing happened. Kane blinked. Then he looked at the device. Then back at James. James grinned. Looking for this? He held up a second detonator, the real one. Kane's face twisted in fury. How? James shrugged. I've been in this game longer than you, Kane. You're not the only one who can set a trap. Kane lunged at him, but James was ready. One clean punch. Kane stumbled back, dazed. James grabbed him by the collar, slamming him against a crate. This is over. Kane smirked, blood dripping from his lip. You still don't get it, do you? James narrowed his eyes. Get what? Kane leaned in. I'm just a messenger. Before James could respond, police sirens blared in the distance. Kane chuckled. You might have won this fight, Colonel. But the war? He grinned, his eyes filled with something unsettling. It's only just beginning. James clenched his jaw. He wanted to end this now, but he knew better. He stepped back just as the police stormed the docks, weapons raised. Kane was arrested on the spot. It was over. For now. A few days later, the charges against James Holloway were officially dropped. Judge Lancaster, still shaken by everything that had happened, announced a full investigation into the corruption within the legal system. Kenneth Reeves resigned the next day, and Donovan Kane vanished. No one knew where he was being held. No records. No trial. It was as if he had never existed. James stood outside the courthouse, looking up at the sky. Graves walked up beside him. So we won. James exhaled. For now. Graves frowned. You think Kane was telling the truth? That there's something bigger out there? James thought about the explosion. The rogue FIB agents. The way Kane had been so confident even in defeat. Yeah, he said finally. I do. Graves sighed. So what now? James turned, a fire in his eyes. Now. He smiled. We find out who's really pulling the strings. The victory felt hollow. James Holloway had won his freedom. His name was cleared, the fabricated charges against him thrown out, and Kane was in custody, at least officially. But something wasn't right. Donovan Kane had been too calm, too smug. Even when he was caught, even when the police took him away, there was no fear in his eyes. Because he knew something. Something James didn't. And that meant this wasn't over. Not even close. James stood outside the courthouse, the cool breeze brushing against his skin as he gazed across the city skyline. He had spent his life fighting wars overseas, facing enemies he could see. But this was different. This enemy was invisible. And that made it even more dangerous. Graves joined him, adjusting his suit. You're thinking about Kane, aren't you? James didn't answer right away. Graves sighed. You should be celebrating. You just took down one of the most powerful men in the shadows. The system worked, for once. James smirked slightly. You really believe that? Graves hesitated. No. James turned to him. Kane wasn't lying when he said he was just a messenger. There's more out there, Alex. More than we see. And if we don't figure out who's pulling the strings. Graves nodded grimly. Then this will happen to someone else. James clenched his jaw. He had seen corruption before, but this was something else entirely. This wasn't about money. This was about control. That night, James sat in his dimly lit apartment, flipping through old case files. Graves had managed to dig up more information on Kane, but it all led to dead ends. No paper trail. No official records. It was like Kane had been erased from history. And that didn't happen by accident. James rubbed his temple, exhaustion creeping in. He needed a lead, something, anything, that could point him in the right direction. Then his phone buzzed. An unknown number. James frowned but answered. Holloway. Silence. Then, a voice. Low. Calculated. Familiar. You should have walked away, Colonel. James' blood ran cold. It was Kane. His grip on the phone tightened. You're supposed to be locked up. Kane chuckled. Come on, James. You and I both know that was never going to happen. James exhaled sharply. Where are you? Kane ignored the question. Let me give you some free advice. You don't want to dig any deeper into this. You don't want to know what's really going on. Just take your win and go home. James felt his heartbeat slow, his instincts sharpening. That's fear in your voice, Kane. Kane went quiet for a moment. Then, he spoke again. You think you won? He chuckled softly. You don't even know what game you're playing. James' jaw clenched. Then tell me. Kane sighed. All right, Colonel. I'll do you one favor. Look into the Sentinel Initiative. James frowned. What is it? Click. Kane hung up. James stared at the phone in his hand, his mind racing. The Sentinel Initiative. He had never heard of it before. But if Kane was giving him a name, It meant someone didn't want him to find it, and that meant he had to. The next morning, James sat across from Graves in a quiet coffee shop, the early morning sun casting long shadows on the walls. Sentinel Initiative? Graves repeated, stirring his coffee. Never heard of it. James nodded. Neither have I. But Kane wouldn't just give me a name for no reason. He wants me to chase it. Graves sighed. And you're going to, aren't you? James smirked. You know me too well. Graves took a sip of his coffee. All right, let's assume this Sentinel Initiative is real. Where do we start? James tapped the table. We go to the one place they don't want us looking. Graves frowned. And where's that? James leaned in. The Federal Intelligence Bureau. Graves groaned. Oh, fantastic. Let's just break into one of the most secure government agencies in the country. Sounds like a great plan. James shrugged. You got a better one? Graves sighed. Unfortunately, no. James smirked. Then let's get to work. That night, the FIB headquarters loomed in the distance, a massive steel and glass fortress of government power. James and Graves sat in a black sedan, watching from across the street. All right, Graves muttered, adjusting his earpiece. Remind me why I agreed to this again? Because you're too stubborn to let this go, James said, smirking. Graves sighed. Yeah, that sounds right. James checked his watch. All right, we have exactly 10 minutes before their security rotation changes. Let's move. They stepped out of the car, moving quickly toward the side entrance of the building. James had spent the last 12 hours gathering intel on the FIB's security patterns, and he knew they had a small window to get inside undetected. Graves swiped a stolen ID badge at the access panel. The door clicked open. They slipped inside. Inside the FIB archives, James and Graves moved through the dimly lit corridors, keeping their footsteps light. We need to get to the classified records section, James whispered. Graves rolled his eyes. Oh, is that all? Just casually break into a high-security data vault. James smirked. You're getting the hang of this. They reached a locked door marked restricted access. James pulled out a small device and attached it to the electronic lock. It beeped twice, then the door slid open. Where do you get these gadgets? Graves muttered. James grinned. Old friends. They stepped inside. Rows of files and digital servers lined the room. James moved quickly, scanning the shelves. Then, he found it. A single, unmarked file tucked away in a restricted cabinet. James pulled it out and flipped it open. His eyes widened. Because now, he understood why Kane had told him to look. The Sentinel Initiative wasn't just some secret program. It was a shadow operation. And at the top of the document, one name stood out above the rest. A name James never expected to see. Graves peered over his shoulder. No way. James clenched his jaw. The document was signed by none other than Judge Richard Lancaster. James stared at the document, his fingers tightening around the edges. His mind raced as he tried to process what he was looking at. The Sentinel Initiative wasn't just some obscure government project. It was a black ops operation buried so deep within the system that it didn't officially exist. And the signature at the bottom? Judge Richard Lancaster. Graves exhaled sharply beside him. This is why he was so eager to shut down your case, he muttered. He's not just some corrupt judge. He's part of whatever this is. James clenched his jaw. He was never afraid of us exposing him. He was afraid we'd expose this. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. James snapped the file shut. Time to go. Graves groaned. I was hoping you'd say that before we broke into a federal building. James smirked, slipping the file into his jacket. Too late now. The door handle jiggled. James reacted instantly, grabbing Graves by the collar and pulling him behind a row of cabinets. A second later, the door swung open, and two FIB agents stepped inside. They scanned the room, their hands resting on their holstered weapons. Did you hear that? One of them asked. The other frowned. Might have been a false alarm. Security sweeps are clean. James held his breath. Then, the first agent sighed. All right, let's get out of here. We're already behind schedule. They turned and exited, the door clicking shut behind them. James waited a beat, then exhaled. Move. They slipped out of the records room, moving swiftly back toward the exit. The moment they stepped outside into the cold night air, Graves let out a long breath. That was way too close. James smirked. Wouldn't be fun otherwise. Graves shot him a glare. Remind me to never take a job with you again. James chuckled. Too late. You're in this now. The next morning, James and Graves sat in a diner on the outskirts of town, The stolen Sentinel Initiative file spread out between them. The document detailed a covert program launched nearly 2 decades ago, designed to manipulate global conflicts for strategic gain. And at the center of it, a secret committee. James ran his finger down a list of names. Lancaster was just one of them. Graves nodded. Look at this: financial records, political movements, even military deployments. They weren't just influencing the courts. They were influencing everything. James exhaled sharply. This is bigger than Kane. Graves hesitated. So what's the play here? James clenched his jaw. We bring this to the public. Graves leaned back, rubbing his face. James, you saw what happened last time we got close to the truth. Explosions. Assassination attempts. These people don't play. James met his gaze. That's exactly why we have to do it. Before Graves could respond, James' phone vibrated. A message. Unknown number. You're in over your head, Colonel. Drop this before it's too late. James smirked. Looks like they know we're onto them. Graves sighed. Fantastic. Can't wait for the next death trap. James stood, slipping the file back into his jacket. Come on. We have a judge to visit. Graves groaned. Oh, this should be fun. Judge Lancaster's mansion, that night. The mansion sat on the edge of a private estate, surrounded by tall hedges and heavy security gates. James and Graves sat in a car down the road, watching from a distance. Graves frowned. How do you want to play this? James checked his weapon. We ask nicely. Graves sighed. And when he doesn't answer? James smirked. We ask again. They stepped out of the car, moving through the shadows. James picked the lock on the side gate, slipping through silently. Inside, the estate was eerily quiet. Too quiet. James' instincts screamed at him. Something wasn't right. Then, a single gunshot rang out from inside the mansion. James froze. Damn it. He sprinted forward, shoving the front door open. Inside, the grand foyer was dimly lit. A trail of fresh blood led up the staircase. Graves swallowed hard. We're too late, aren't we? James gritted his teeth. Not yet. They moved up the stairs quickly, following the blood trail to a massive office at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar. James pushed it open. Inside, Judge Richard Lancaster slumped over his desk, a gun in his hand, a bullet hole in his skull. A suicide note lay next to him. Graves cursed under his breath. They got to him first. James picked up the note, scanning it. It was a classic setup, Lancaster admitting to his crimes, claiming full responsibility. A cleanup job. A cover-up. James clenched his fists. Lancaster had been a puppet, but whoever pulled his strings had just cut them before he could talk. Graves exhaled sharply. We need to go? Now. James hesitated, then nodded. They slipped out of the mansion, vanishing into the night. Back at the safe house, James paced the room, his mind spinning. Lancaster was dead. The Sentinel Initiative was real. And now, the people behind it knew James was coming for them. Graves rubbed his temples. This thing is bigger than we thought. James exhaled. Yeah, and we just kicked the hornet's nest. His phone buzzed again. Another message. You should have walked away, Colonel. Now you won't get the chance. Graves read it over James' shoulder and sighed. Well, that's comforting. James smirked. Good. That means we're close. Then, a distant boom. Graves' head snapped up. Was that? The safe house windows shattered as a shockwave ripped through the building. James hit the ground as fire and smoke filled the air. They were under attack. James gritted his teeth, pulling Graves to his feet. They had been found, and whoever was coming for them wasn't planning on leaving survivors. The explosion rocked the entire safe house, sending fire and debris through the air. The walls trembled, windows shattered, and thick black smoke filled the room. James Holloway hit the ground hard, his ears ringing from the shockwave. He coughed, forcing himself up as another blast erupted from outside, shaking the floor beneath him. They weren't just being attacked. They were being erased. Graves groaned beside him, coughing into his sleeve. Remind me, when did we become this important? James grabbed him by the collar and pulled him behind a toppled table as bullets tore through the air. Right around the time we dug up the Sentinel Initiative, James muttered. Outside, dark figures moved through the smoke, tactical gear gleaming under the flickering lights. No emblems. No identifying marks. These weren't government agents. These were cleaners. The kind sent to make sure nothing, and no one, was left behind. Graves peeked over the cover, his eyes widening. James. We are very outnumbered. James exhaled, quickly reloading his weapon. Then we even the odds. He grabbed a flashbang from his belt and pulled the pin. Close your eyes, he warned. Then he tossed it. A blinding white light exploded in the room, followed by a deafening bang. The armed men recoiled, shouting as they staggered back. James didn't hesitate. He moved. He grabbed Graves and sprinted toward the back exit, ducking as more gunfire erupted. Glass shattered. Wood splintered. The safe house was coming down around them. They burst through the back door, running into the alley behind the building. More gunmen were waiting. James didn't slow down. He tackled the nearest one, slamming him into the wall before twisting the gun out of his hands. A second attacker swung at him with a knife. James ducked, driving his elbow into the man's ribs before throwing him to the ground. Graves, to his credit, wasn't just watching. He grabbed a steel pipe from the ground and cracked another assailant across the jaw, sending him sprawling. James turned, yanking Graves forward as more bullets whizzed past them. Car. Now, James barked. Their black sedan was parked down the alley. They sprinted toward it, dodging gunfire as they slid across the hood. James jumped into the driver's seat. Graves barely had time to buckle in before James slammed the gas pedal. The tires screeched as they sped into the night, bullets pinging off the back bumper. Graves exhaled sharply. Well, that was subtle. James smirked. They started it. Graves ran a hand through his hair. Great. So now what? We just keep running until they eventually kill us. James' eyes darkened. No, he said. We take the fight to them. Graves stared at him. James. We've been reacting this entire time, James said, gripping the wheel. It's time we go on offense. Graves sighed. Okay. And how exactly do we fight an invisible enemy? James didn't answer right away. Then he smirked. We find someone who knows more than we do. Graves frowned. And who exactly would that be? James turned to him. Donovan Kane. Undisclosed holding facility, that night. Kane had been locked away in a secret facility since his capture. Or at least, that's what the government thought. James had other sources. Using connections from his military past, he had tracked Kane's whereabouts to a hidden site outside the city, a black site prison, off the books, which meant getting in was going to be a challenge. James and Graves parked outside the heavily guarded perimeter, scanning the facility through binoculars. Graves sighed. I just want it on record that this is insane. James smirked. Duly noted. Graves exhaled, rubbing his temples. So what's the plan? James reached into the back seat and pulled out a military-grade sniper rifle. Graves blinked. Oh, that's the plan. James loaded the weapon. Cover me from here. I'll go in quiet. Graves groaned. You realize I don't have sniper training, right? James clapped him on the shoulder. Time to learn. Then, without another word, he slipped into the shadows. Inside the facility, James moved silently, his military instincts kicking in. He took down 2 guards with swift, precise movements, dragging their unconscious bodies out of sight. He reached the lower levels, where high-security prisoners were kept. Kane was in cell B7. James reached the heavy steel door and swiped a stolen keycard. The lock clicked. James stepped inside. Kane sat on the small cot, shackled, looking completely unbothered. The moment he saw James, he smirked. Well, I was wondering when you'd show up. James shut the door behind him. We need to talk. Kane leaned back. Oh, about what? James tossed the Sentinel Initiative file onto his lap. Kane picked it up, flipping through it with mild amusement. Then he chuckled. So that's what you found. James folded his arms. Tell me everything. Kane exhaled. You really want to know? James clenched his jaw. I wouldn't be here if I didn't. Kane's smirk faded slightly. Then, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. The Sentinel Initiative isn't just a project, Colonel. It's a reset button. James narrowed his eyes. Explain. Kane tapped the file. You think this is about you? About one trial? One corrupt judge? He shook his head. This is about controlling everything. Politics, media, military conflicts, every crisis, every scandal. You think they happen naturally? James' stomach tightened. Kane smirked. The Sentinel Initiative was designed to manufacture chaos, to manipulate the world stage, to ensure that those in power stay in power. James clenched his fists. Who's behind it? Kane leaned back. Names don't matter, Colonel. The moment you start looking, they'll come for you. And trust me. He grinned. They're already on their way. James turned to leave. We'll see about that. Kane's voice stopped him. You're making a mistake, Holloway. James smirked over his shoulder. You said that last time. Then he walked out. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. James Holloway walked out of the darkened cell, his mind racing. Kane's words echoed in his head. The Sentinel Initiative was designed to manufacture chaos, to manipulate the world stage, to ensure that those in power stay in power. He had spent his entire life fighting wars on foreign soil, battles where the enemy had a face, a flag, a cause. But this was a war fought in shadows, a war where the enemy wasn't an army. It was control itself. As he stepped into the cold night air, Graves' voice crackled in his earpiece. Tell me we're done. James exhaled. Not yet. Graves groaned. Of course not. What did Kane say? James climbed into the van they had stolen for the mission and started the engine. Everything we thought? It's worse. Graves buckled in beside him. Fantastic. So what now? James stared at the road ahead, the weight of everything pressing down on him. Then he made his choice. We take it down. Graves blinked. James, come on. This isn't just some corrupt politician or a rogue prosecutor. This is global. You really think two guys can stop this? James smirked. I don't know, but I'm sure as hell going to try. Graves sighed, rubbing his temples. I really hate being your friend sometimes. James chuckled. You love it. Graves groaned. Unfortunately. Then, they drove off into the night. 3 days later, James stood outside a rundown bar in the middle of nowhere. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the faint hum of country music. Inside, a group of men sat at a corner booth, their voices low. Not just any men. Former operatives. Ghosts. People who had been erased from the system because they knew too much. And they were exactly who James needed. He stepped forward, sliding into an empty chair. The group went silent. One of them, a grizzled man with a scar down his cheek, eyed James carefully. You must be desperate, Colonel. James smirked. Something like that. The scarred man leaned forward. What do you want? James set a single folder on the table. The Sentinel Initiative. He met their gazes. I need soldiers. The man flipped through the pages, his expression darkening. This is big. James nodded. Yeah, and I can't take it down alone. The man studied him for a moment. Then he chuckled. You're a crazy son of A.B. H. Holloway. James grinned. So I've been told. The man exhaled. Then he extended his hand. James shook it. The war had just begun. The final broadcast. 1 week later, news stations across the world received a video. A grainy, untraceable recording. A man sitting in the shadows, his voice calm but firm. The world is not what you think it is. You have been lied to. There are forces controlling your lives, your governments, your freedoms, your wars. They decide who rises and who falls. They create fear to keep you obedient. And they have been doing it for decades. This is called the Sentinel Initiative. And we're going to expose it. My name is Colonel James Holloway. And I will not stop until the truth is known. The video cut off. Within hours, it had been viewed by millions. Governments denied everything. Officials scrambled. And in a dark office somewhere, a faceless man picked up his phone. A single order was given. Find him. Kill him. James sat in a safe house, watching the chaos unfold on the news. Graves sighed beside him. You really know how to make enemies, huh? James smirked. Yeah, but I also know how to win. He loaded his weapon. The war was here, and he was ready.